Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Let's jump right in. When you hear buzzwords like sustainability or a product's environmental footprint, what comes to mind? Usually, we just assume that tools measuring these things are purely objective, right? Just neutral, hard science. But what if they aren't? What if the very metrics we rely on to figure out what's actually green were forged in a massive, high-stakes battle for economic control? Today, we're diving into the totally fascinating, kind of hidden history of how environmental measurement was shaped by an incredibly exclusive group of elites, and spoiler alert, it wasn't just to save the planet, it was to protect their own institutional power. So, that brings us to the big, provocative question we're going to unpack today. Is environmental measurement purely objective science, or is it actually a tool for elite power? We're going to look really closely at a groundbreaking study that dug into the origins of environmental management accounting over in France. And what we're going to find is that the tools we use to measure our environmental impact are tangled with power, politics, and the desperate preservation of status.
Okay, to make sense of all this, we first need to talk about the tool at the very center of our story. It's called life cycle assessment, or LCA for short. Basically, it's a deeply quantified assessment of all the materials and energy going into and coming out of a system across a product's entire life cycle, literally from dirt to dirt. Today, LCA is widely considered the absolute holy grail of modern environmental decision-making. It's the hidden engine behind eco-labels, green supply chains, you name it. But here's the thing. LCA didn't just magically fall out of the sky. It was meticulously, intentionally constructed.
So, here's our roadmap for the explainer. We'll start with number 1, the holy grail of sustainability. Number 2, enter the French elite. Number 3, a blueprint for institutional power. Number 4, mobilization, identity, and locking. And finally, number 5, a complex elite legacy.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the holy grail of sustainability.
Picture this. It's the early 1990s, and it is an absolute pressure cooker for European industry. A wave of brand new European regulations was seriously threatening French heavy manufacturing. For instance, there was massive pressure coming out of Brussels around the 1994 EU Packaging Directive. Scandinavian and German countries were pushing these really aggressive environmental policies, like super strict recycling mandates that were going to put French industry at a huge disadvantage. So French companies urgently needed a way to assess and honestly defend against these looming regulatory threats. Which leads us perfectly into Section 2, enter the French elite. So who did French industry call to fight off these threats? Well, they didn't call grassroots environmental activists, that's for sure. They turned to the absolute highest echelons of their own engineering elite, specifically the graduates of the super prestigious École Polytechnique and the Corps des Mines. To give you an idea of how exclusive this is, one insider bluntly said that being a mineur in France is literally like holding an aristocratic title in the Ancien Regime. It's an incredibly tight-knit, old boy network that historically ran all of France's heavy industries and energy sectors. They had immense power, and they saw defending French industry as their personal mandate. Now, this elite group brought a very, very specific worldview, or thought style, to the table. To them, the environment wasn't some holistic, qualitative, or activist cause. Not at all. They framed it strictly as a highly technical, insanely complex mathematical problem. And in their minds, only the top, most technically proficient engineers could possibly solve it. This mindset was wild because it completely shut the door on any alternative perspectives from NGOs or political ecologists. Basically, if you couldn't calculate it with advanced math, they didn't want to hear it. Let's move right along to Section 3, a blueprint for institutional power. So how exactly did they pull this off? Well, they used what researchers call 3 intertwined levels of institutional work. Think of it like a giant strategic puzzle. At the very top, their overarching goal was maintenance, literally maintaining their elite status and discretionary power over French industry. But to do that while fending off new environmental laws, they had to invent something totally new, which is the creative step. And finally, to protect that new invention, they had to use on-the-ground resistance strategies. Let's break that down a bit more. To pull off that top-level maintenance goal of protecting heavy industry, they had to drop down to level 2, creative work. They didn't just write a white paper. They basically invented a brand new environmental consulting service and a tool they called the écobilan, which was the French precursor to the modern life cycle assessment we just talked about. They invented a whole specialized profession around it and pitched it as a vital patriotic service to protect the national economy. And you know what's crazy? The creators were actually incredibly open about why they did this. Check out this quote from one of the consultants. One of the reasons we started écobilan was precisely to counteract German influence in the regulatory systems. The écobilan was deliberately built as a combative tool, a Trojan horse, really. By using this massively complex multi-criteria mathematical approach, they could argue against strict single-issue mandates, like demanding 100% recycling, by proving that sometimes the Germanic way actually harmed the environment somewhere else in the supply chain. Honestly, it was a brilliant defensive maneuver. All right, let's dig into the nuts and bolts in Section 4, Mobilization, Identity, and Locking. So first up in the resistance strategy was mobilization. These consultants didn't just knock on random doors. They tapped straight into that elite old boy network. Because their fellow alumni already held the top positions in the French Environmental Agency and the strategic boards of major industrial groups, they rapidly secured a national monopoly on government bids. Crucially, they bypassed traditional corporate environmental departments completely. They pitched this incredibly complex tool directly to the CEOs and the strategic elite. Then came what experts call identity work. See, for corporate executives to take this tool seriously, it absolutely could not look like environmental activism. So the écobilan elite deliberately distanced themselves from traditional environmentalists. Instead, they mimicked highly respected corporate professions, like Anglo-Saxon strategy consultants and financial auditors. They even named the tool écobilan. Bilan is the French word for a financial balance sheet. They were sending a crystal clear signal. We aren't tree huggers, we are the accountants of the environment. But here's the catch. What happens when other people try to copy your shiny, lucrative new tool? Well, you lock them out. The elite intentionally black-boxed their whole methodology. They built massive private data sets that literally no one else had access to. They hid their math inside incredibly complex proprietary software. By making the whole process super secretive, overwhelmingly technical, and tremendously expensive, they guaranteed that smaller consultancies, NGOs, and non-elites simply couldn't interfere or compete with them. And that brings us to their ultimate trump card, standardization. By 1994, France actually became the very first country in the world to standardize the LCA methodology. As one consultant pointed out, the whole point of standardizing is to plant your flag and say, I am the standard and others must follow me. By codifying their very specific, highly complex way of doing things into French law, they ended up heavily influencing the global ISO 14040 standard that came later. They permanently locked in their elite vision of environmental measurement worldwide. Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, a complex elite legacy. Fast forward to today, and the legacy of all this is pretty wild. We're looking at a huge tug-of-war between popularization and demonization. On one side, you have people trying to democratize LCA, making simplified software so small businesses can finally measure their own carbon footprints. But on the other side, the elite are still doing their maintenance work by totally demonizing these simplifications. They argue that making the tool easier to use is technically incorrect, or they dismiss it as paternalism. They are still fighting tooth and nail to keep environmental measurement as a complex expert-only club. And the fallout from this historical blackboxing is actually huge. One of the people interviewed in the source material put it perfectly, saying, I fear that the smaller companies will have trouble keeping up with large companies, and those large companies will impose their worldview. Because this tool was deliberately built to be so expensive and complex, it successfully keeps smaller players out of the room, which just continuously reinforces the power and the worldview of massive corporations. Which leaves us with a pretty heavy question to chew on. We rely so much on these environmental metrics to guide us towards a sustainable future, right? But if these tools, like the life cycle assessment, were originally built by the elite for the elite, basically as a combative weapon to protect their own economic interests, can they ever truly serve the broader public interest? It completely changes how you look at a green label at the grocery store, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope it sparks a new curiosity about the invisible structures shaping our world. See you next time.